Hey, all, and welcome to Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and chit chat about intriguing and sometimes controversial topics through the lens of skepticism. With us today, we have Richard Gilliver from Skeptic Takeout and Laura McGee from Unapologetically Me. Richard Gill from the Yorkshire Atheist was unable to join us today, so prepare yourselves. Laura and Richard will be going off on some tangents. Why? Because today's topic is history. So grab your English tea or your crisp, clean coconut water and join us as we delve deep into the concept of delving deep into our past. This is episode 24, History. Okay. Hey, so how are you doing today, Mr. Richard?
I am okay. I'm feeling. I think we need to keep ourselves on tracks because I don't know if a lot of the viewers know this, but we're quite good friends. And
Yes, and we're both chatty and talkative.
we're both really chatty. So we've really having to keep ourselves in line. We haven't got Gil here to kind of keep us
Bring
in
us
line
back
and keep us
around.
on track.
So, and the other thing is, like, it's a topic that just happens to be a passion for both of us.
Yeah,
definitely. And I've been out of studying history for a while because I went into studying, like, as you know, anthropology and getting into some other subjects in homeschooling. So history as a specific topic hasn't been something I've been actively studying in the recent, like, maybe 1 or 2 years, but still a passion. So I think not only is it going to be excitingly potentially drab as we go on and on and on about what we have to say, but I'm a little worried that if we get into specific historical topics, I'll start getting like stuff wrong. So I'm thinking let's talk more about history and not so much about historical events. keep Laura on the up and
up. Before we start, I just want to highlight that in last week's show, I misgendered our guest. I want to keep highlighting that because we need to normalize it. We need to highlight when we make mistakes. We need to all stand up and own them. And, I did it live while we were recording the show. Our guest was very gracious. We need to normalize it. If you make the mistake, own up to it, move on. Let's get this normalized. Let's get it being okay in society to make a mistake, acknowledge it, and move on from it.
And the easiest way to stop making that mistake is to correct yourself on the point, like what Richard did. As soon as he realized it, he cut us off and said, hey, I need to make this correction right here. The more you can self-correct, the easier it is, because you're reinforcing it in your own brain. I think a lot of people don't mind when people make that mistake. But like Rudy said last week, they were saying, well, if I don't correct somebody, then they're never going to get it. So I understand when they call me she, and I don't have an emotional problem with it, but if I don't correct it, then they're going to keep getting that reinforced, and it's gonna be hard to make the change.
Don't be offended if someone does correct you if you make the mistake.
Absolutely.
It's all about normalizing it. It's what we should be doing.
We're so socially programmed to see genders as so binary and like identifying physical features as being the same as your gender, and it's just not. It's not something that we're used to because this cultural change is happening so slowly. So I think that the more steam and the more that we stand up and use pronouns more flexibly and more openly, the more we challenge gender norms, I think the more easy it's going to be for future generations.
Definitely.
My kids don't even struggle with it. But yeah, so enough about gender and on to history. Yeah.
So I was on The Perspective a couple of weeks ago. And
you weren't. Were you?
Was.
Oh my God.
I was.
So guys, go check them out on The Perspective.
The last call we took was a guy who was kind of denying that things in history happened the way that they'd been reported to have happened.
What was the basis of his argument?
that someone else had made an argument that he found convincing. And it was really frustrating for me, because when I was trying to push him by saying, well, what are the specific points? What are your specific points? He just kept me referring to me to this third person. And
he referred to you in the third person, or he
referred to the
another person.
Yeah.
So and so says this, and so and so teaches that.
And I was saying, I'm not talking to them. I'm talking to you. What is it you think about it? And he just kept saying, well, what they say is this. And that was so frustrating, because, of course, the greatest things about having these conversations is that you can sit down and really break down and get into the nitty gritty. But you can't do that if someone's deflecting. And I found that really, really frustrating. But the kind of gist of his argument was that it's always a they with conspiracy theories, they have hidden the true history from us. And all the buildings that we've got now that they're telling us are like cathedrals and things, which are like nearly 1,000 years old, some of them,
right,
or over 1,000 years old, some of them. They're not really that old. They're newer than that, and we're just told they're that old to hide the true history, which we never got down to what it was. But I found that fascinating. I found that fascinating. So, considering we're talking about history, let's delve a little bit into like weird history.
I don't know what you mean by weird history, but I do want to touch on what you just said super quick, because that, God, there's so much there. We could probably spend the whole hour just on what you just said, because it made me think of multiple angles that we could approach it. But the one that strikes me the most is how do you determine what's history and what's not, and like where you get your facts. And it's really intriguing to me that you have the historians, and they can go back and check source documents, and they can double check things, read accounts. And now, granted, even from what I've learned in anthropology, researchers in the past have gotten things wrong. And so you can be reading like a peer-reviewed article or something that was published years ago, and it could be completely invalid, but it's still out there in academia. So I get that criticism. But you have a lot of access to information and source documents, and you can go check for yourself. But then you have these like, hey, this is the real history, and here's the thing with like what are the lizard people called, and like all these different, you know what I'm saying? Like, oh, there's this secret past, or this I think there was one on YouTube where they refer to it as like sacred history, where it's like, oh, here's the real history, right? And it was just bizarre. And so that's my question, I guess. That what you say about deflecting, that's my second point. But my question is like, where are the source documents for all that? Where's the research? Where's the ability to confirm it? Oh, well, it was written in this book. And oh, well, if you look at these documents, they can also be interpreted this way. Okay, well, great. Let's talk about all the different possible interpretations, and let's figure out contextually which one makes the most sense. But where are you getting your information, right? From this guy in the 70s who wrote a book while he was like high on LSD, or are you getting it from like real academic pursuits, you know?
The thing is, even I think it's one of those areas where if you're unsure of kind of the established consensus, and if you're listening to these guys on YouTube, or the Eric von Danikens and things,
I was thinking of him when you were talking.
I know you was. That's why I mentioned him. This episode's going to be so much fun. when you're talking, when you've got those kinds of people, they kind of take the fact that studying history is there's a lot of it is taking a little bit from here and a little bit from there, and comparing and assessing, and they take that as a bad thing. They see it as a weakness, and they say, well, right, you know, you haven't got any solid evidence, so how do you know it's really true? But of course, it is solid evidence when you've got. I have this argument with Christian apologists or Islamic apologists quite a lot, but mainly Christian ones when we're talking about early Christian texts. And they say, they love to compare Jesus to Alexander the Great. Now, I've not done much study on Alexander the Great.
Because the comparison is that there's more evidence that Jesus lived than there is evidence that Alexander the Great lived. Yeah, just to clarify.
I don't know what the case about that is. So I always just say, I'll talk, because I genuinely don't know. I've not looked into Alexander the Great. So what I tend to do is say, I'll tell you what, let's push that aside and let's compare Jesus to Cleopatra.
Mm-hmm.
Because Cleopatra lived, I think she was, it was about 30 years previous to Jesus when she died. So she's almost contemporary with Jesus. She's a little bit before him. She comes from a long line of the Ptolemy rulers who were Greek descended, but Egyptian rulers. And, you've got these sources about Jesus which don't appear until after he died. But with Cleopatra, you've got coins with a face on, contemporary to her. You've got busts she had made of herself. You've got carvings on the sides of Egyptian temples that she had made to her. You've got all this contemporary evidence, as well as the later historical writings that you've got for Jesus. And there's just so much more. Assessing history isn't just about I think people think all historians do. Pick up a couple of old documents, read them, and make their mind up. But
or even worse, they think that they pick up the old writings of somebody else. Like somebody else read the old document and then they wrote a history. Like Christian apologists, they quote God, what is his name? The one who just happens to mention Christians in his text as being a non-Christian source that mentions Jesus. God, the historian, hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago.
Hundreds.
Well, he was.
You've got me thinking now, and God. I should know this. I'm so embarrassed I can't remember.
Yeah, he's a Jewish historian. Can't remember his name to save my life.
Everybody knows his name.
Yeah, that one. And he was that one, like 200 years after Jesus or something like that. Yeah. And this is why I didn't want to do history that I don't want to talk about history itself, because dates and names and stuff get all jumbled when it's not fresh in my head. But a lot of people will quote
it basically,
it's not source documents, it's quoting.
The guy who Laura's talking about wrote a history mentioning and there's a little bit of controversy surrounding the end of it when it comes to the bit about Jesus being crucified. But even if we just take that as legitimate, because it's not decided on whether it's a forgery or a later edition or not. But he wrote about the Christians and who believed in the anointed one. And of course, anointed, they talked about the Christ, but Christ is just the Greek version of the anointed one, which applied to kings throughout the Old Testament and Jewish history and stuff. So there's a lot of one-sided looking at it, but I don't really want to go down the Christian route. I want to talk about history in general. I know I brought Christianity up, so
yeah, but the point that you were trying to get at, though, is that they don't mention Christ as somebody that they lived beside or that they had experience with. It was the Christians believed that he was crucified.
Yeah, but my point actually was, the larger point I was making is that history isn't just looking at old documents.
Right.
There's a lot of supporting evidence where you might have to, even if you've got two historians who disagree with each other, the fact that they're disagreeing with each other is a good sign that, there is at least they're talking about the subject, which means it was being talked about. And it's not just someone sat in a shady room writing his own
and decided what the truth was. So that brings up a really good point, because a lot of people see history as being so linear and cut and dry, and it's like, oh, well, it's published in this book, therefore the historians have agreed that it's true. And one thing is that, and this is what I think is so beautiful about study in general, including history, is that it is so fluid. Like, we are so needy about having like what actually happened, or what's the truth, or what is the actual determination, that we are like, oh, well, these two are arguing about it, so I'm going to pick his truth, or, well, they just don't know anything because they can't decide, and so I'm going to go over here and think about this because it's been proven. And what I think we all need to keep in mind with history in general, but also other subjects, is that it's okay for it to be fluid, and it's okay for us to not know and to not have exact answers. I think that's a lot more honest and gives us a lot more like a much broader look into our past when we're able to look at it from multiple angles.
I think it makes it much more fun.
Yeah, well,
it's
that
so
too.
It's fun.
Intriguing was the word I was trying to find. It's a lot more intriguing. So fun, yeah. When you have like, oh, we have X documents, they say X things. Like you talk about Plato's accounts and stuff, and it's like, well, how much of it is real? How much of it is allegory? How much are stories? Did Plato even really exist? Well, why does there have to be a total final determination? How come we can't continue the discussion in that same curious sort of not jump to conclusions sort of route and just here's what was written and here's what we do and don't know about it and let's talk about it. And what does it mean for humanity?
The fact is, whether Plato existed or not, or Alexander the Great existed or not, they've had an impact on history and what especially the great philosophers, the old Greek philosophers, they've had such an impact on thought, on science, on everything. And that's another thing about history, the way that it really informs where we are now.
Yeah.
And it's so good to be able to draw that line. I know we said you don't want to draw a distinct, this is the way things were.
Right.
But just to see how things have come along and just to think about it, about that we've mentioned on the show in the past, how the Islamic scholars and philosophers of the 10th century, 10th and 11th centuries did so much work.
Oh yeah.
Towards
cataloging
like medical
and
stuff,
and
mathematics, medicine.
Absolutely, yeah. Talk about a curious group of people who were willing to explore and ask questions and record things. Like it's stunning how much came out of that. But yeah, and I do want to like preface what you were saying or go back and sort of justify what I was saying. I think that regardless of whether or not we can come to a final conclusion, I agree with you that like we can learn from our past. So even if an account isn't exactly true the way that it's written, what can we learn about human nature? And I think there's multiple things. It's like one is how can we not repeat the mistakes of the past? We can move forward and improve as a species. But then the other thing is almost like a free pass, like, hey, we're just human. Like, yes, there's war and there's famine now. There's always been war and famine. Yes, there's horrible people and there's good people and there's these struggles and there's people vying for political power, but there always has been since civilizations, like the earliest civilizations, when they were established, like that's when warfare was established, right? So it, in a way, it also like helps us to understand it's not about good and evil or sin or are we better now than we were back then? It's also understanding our nature. And I think that even if Alexander never existed, his story can tell us a lot about human nature.
Yeah. And when we, as in me and you, generally talk about history, we generally are talking about kind of either biblical or religious history. That's certainly on this show. It's been largely the focus, but history goes back much further than that. And you know, when we're studying history, when we're looking at history, you know, you're looking at it covers so many different areas. I was thinking about woolly mammoths. No, actually, I'll come on to that in a second. But it covers so many different areas. So it can geology, geography, you know, all these different areas of study. Really, anthropology,
evolution, anthropology,
It covers so many areas, and it's to be good at assessing history. I think you need to take all those areas into account, and you need to communicate across those areas. It's not just a case of looking at, as I say, old books, old scraps of paper, what the historians wrote. There's one of my lecturers at university, I wasn't sure if it was her who coined it, but certainly uses it quite a lot as a case of material Christianity. And it's about the material traditions of studying history, not just studying the books, but looking at objects, looking at the way objects were related
ruins
to,
and art and
and all that informs things. It can tell you so much about things,
and also so little. And that's one thing that we don't
yeah
emphasize enough. Like, we have to all be more
yeah
academically, we have to have more academic integrity, because like there was one thing I was teaching my kids, and we were watching a video on YouTube about it, and it was like we were learning about mythology, and how we know about all the different myths and stuff. And so we were going through all the different myths and learning about them. We learned about archetypes, and we learned about genres and what they all have. Like, we covered them from so many different angles. But one thing was, there are certain myths out there that we've created this sort of like dialogue of what happened. That's not the right word, but narrative. There you go. We've created sort of narrative about what happened. But the only material evidence we have for that myth is like a relief. And the relief has these pictures on it. And based on the pictures, here's what happened. And this guy went through the hero's journey, and he did all this stuff, and he conquered this beast, and blah, blah, blah. And we are writing that myth for that civilization and for that culture based on a relief and we assume that these symbols represent the same things that we think they represent. And what's interesting about that, not to go on too long of a tirade on this, but I was speaking to a paleontologist friend of mine who was talking about petroglyphs, and he was like, what a lot of people don't realize is the meaning behind the petroglyphs. So like, you might have a buffalo, right? And it's got horns, and like the number of horns it has is like the distance to whatever. And I'm gonna say this wrong, like the symbology of it, I'm just pulling off the top of my head as an example, but it's like number of feet is the distance to the water, the number of horns is whether there's more animals or less or whatever. And so they're giving directions. If you see a circle with a dot in the middle of it, that represents like something along the way as you're walking along the path, like stop here. I don't know, but he remembered, like he walked this path where he like looked at the circle, he learned how to read it, and so he looked up this way, and he goes up and he follows it and around the rock, and sure enough, he found a place that was an ancient campsite based on following the directions. And it's like, they were telling people where to go. But we see a dot in a circle, and we're like, they worship the sun. And we see buffalo, and they're like, they're drawing pictures of their animal gods or whatever. And they were literally giving directions for nomadic tribes to move between summer and winter through different areas. And so now you go back to that relief that I'm talking about. We have no idea what the symbology of those things were and those people.
No.
So
and I think going back to, and I don't want to stick on the kind of new agey Von Danikens, and I'm going to pick on him constantly.
He's an easy target.
Eric Von, and that's why I'm abusing him. The Eric Von Danikens of this world for too long, but that is what informs a lot of their bullshittery. The fact that they do just come along and see it and interpret it how they will.
I did hear something like he retranslated some ancient like Sanskrit words or something to better fit like the actual translations that the historians have agreed upon is different from his translations. And I don't know. I have a lot of skepticism towards him. But
I know we've spoken on the show before about ancient aliens and how they give the disclaimer. I'm not going on a rant this time, though, I promise. How they always give a disclaimer on the show about like.
I'm not saying it was.
No, because what they say on virtually every episode is experts agree that this is X is the case, but maybe there's another interpretation. And let's go down that route instead and just ignore what the experts have said.
Yes, it's either that or it's I'm not like Giorgio Tsoukalos, that crazy fellow, and I'm not saying it was extraterrestrial, but it could have been extraterrestrials. Like, whatever. Right. But no, but that just goes to show how really complicated history can be, right? Like the fact that there can be so many interpretations. And people kind of spin it the way they want to.
And I want to come back to the woolly mammoth because I was reading an article a couple of days ago, I think it was, about the permafrost melting in Siberia. And they've just discovered a woolly, I think it was a woolly rhinoceros, and it's in such good state of preservation. Cool. Yeah, I mean, like I think there's even some soft tissue there because it's been frozen solid for this. It's amazing. And I mean, it's tragic that the permafrost is melting.
Yeah.
The insights that, you know, we can learn from, even from these tragedies, are so informative for us, for history.
Yeah, it tells, and there's two things about that. And the quick one first is like how it allows us to have a broader, deeper, more thorough understanding of our past. But then it teaches us to be a little bit humble, right? Like we write all these solid truths, and then we discover a technology that allows us to test something, or we uncover a dig site or something like that.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we have to like reframe and rewrite history. And I guess that's something that really should humble us and cause us to be more flexible. So if you're reading, like, I don't know, kids are taught that history is history. It's written in a history book, therefore it's done. Just like a math book. Math's not going to change, right? Grammar rules aren't going to change very much. And then like it's just like that. History is not going to change, right? We need to stop teaching it that way and start seeing things as being more like evolving and developing.
I think we need archaeologists to come out more and teach more history, because archaeologists really do have a good grasp of, you know, they get so excited when something doesn't meet expectation, because and that's what they want. They want something which is going to challenge them. I was very lucky in school. And I mean, I was only around 10 years old, and we actually had an archaeologist as one of our teachers. And I learned so much from it. I spoke a couple of weeks ago actually about the dinosaurs when the Diplodocus kind of got recategorized, and I think it was him who kind of pushed that thing and that set a whole ball rolling for me.
Oh yeah,
and I've,
or the fact that dinosaurs have feathers. Well, that's a little bit big.
That wasn't, well, I don't think that was widely known.
No,
it
not
certainly
for a long
wasn't publicly known. It wasn't taught in schools and stuff when I was like 9 or 10.
No, I learned that like just in the last decade.
Yeah.
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 But that's an example of like what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was Archaeopteryx who was found and kind of kicked that whole ball rolling off the famous.
Yeah.
But I think there's now. Last time I heard, and I could be wrong on this, because this was a couple of years ago, but I think they've been actually found 7 variants of it, because there was a lot of controversy at first about the first Archaeopteryx that were found, because a lot of people were arguing that the feathers were actually from, I
like
think they were arguing that it was 2 fossils that had been pressed together. So the dinosaur had kind of been pressed with a bird. and that's like, I think they have actually found 7 different examples now of and going back a couple of years when I last read the article on it, of Archaeopteryx. So it's kind of, it's coming into being and establishing now that the birds are direct descendants of dinosaurs,
not lizards. Yeah.
And that, which is exciting.
That brings me to, God, I hate it when like you say something and I know what I want to say and then it's like gone. Like changing our concepts of dinosaurs. Nope, it's gone. Go ahead and press.
Wing it. Where's Richard when you need him?
You were talking about dinosaurs and you were talking about history, and how we need to rewrite it and stuff like that sometimes.
Yeah, I think dinosaurs have done that quite a lot for us, because there's always new discoveries coming along. I mean, like I said, I've just mentioned Diplodocus. When I was at school, that was the biggest dinosaur, and that's like being way blown out of the water now. I don't know what is the one called Gigantosaurus?
Yeah, like it was Argentinosaurus, and I think they found one bigger. Yeah, or they reclassified it, but just massively huge. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense to me how creatures can get that big, but
no, I think it was the oxygen. Wasn't it something to do with the oxygen level?
I think so. That's the theory that I've heard. Yeah, I've heard that theory. Great. So talking about changing how you understand things, right? And you were talking about the importance of paleontologists and archaeologists and stuff like that. Just as an example, like when I was studying anthropology and I did a study on the Paiute, which is a Native American tribe that lives throughout my area.
Right.
And it wasn't on the recommended list, so I knew that it would be like unique and something that wasn't well studied. It was the first time that the teacher had learned about it, so that was kind of exciting. Right. But they actually migrated up about 1,000 years ago, so not too long before Europeans came over to America. They migrated up from South America, so they are actually related to the Inca, like the Inca, and they call it Inca and Aztec or whatever, like where they have the hyphen, Azteca. Anyway, they're related to the Aztecs, and they're a tribe based off of them, and they know us by DNA, right? They've done DNA comparisons, and they actually know what migration routes they took to get up. Yeah. Why that's so interesting is, well, two reasons. One is we always assume that like, oh, the people that settled here came over from Europe and Russia, and like over the land bridge, and then they came down. But there's a lot more evidence now that people actually came by boat. Like they potentially may have come both ways, but to make it all the way down to South America and then migrate all the way back up, it's constantly rewriting and helping us to re-understand the history of the Americas and like our migratory patterns. And it keeps pushing the date further and further back, like 10,000 years, 7,000 years, 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 40,000 years, right? And it's like, people have been here a long time, okay? Right?
Well, one thing I find really interesting about the Central and South America thing is, I mean, I have always had this concept, and I don't know whether this is just me being an idiot or whether kind of everybody has this kind of idea, because quite a lot of it is overgrown now. I've always had the kind of idea that you had these pyramids surrounded by maybe small towns and then just loads of jungle.
Yeah, like tons of space and
20
they have
miles
very
away,
complex trade routes, and
but they were huge, and that's what I was going to point out, the trade route, because I watched a documentary a couple of years ago, maybe not that long ago, and it was actually talking about from what's the big pyramid, the step pyramid called? I don't know what.
Oh, Chichen Itza, or
that's the one, Chichen Itza.
Okay.
Well, apparently there was like a really major trade route north from that, and a massive port. And this has only just recently been like, I don't even know if it's kind of a consensus opinion. I think this certainly the documentary I watched, it was still kind of new, and they were saying that they suspected that there was this huge port and there'd been these massive trade routes, and it was completely rewriting what they understood.
Absolutely. Yeah. To think of South Americans as predominantly, like in the beginning at least, like seafarers and fishermen, and people were along the coast first. And what's really cool to me is the Obsidian trade routes, because Obsidian it's a rock, right? So it doesn't degrade, it doesn't break very easily. Even if you have a broken arrowhead or weapon or blade, you can still tell that it's an arrowhead or a weapon. So you have Obsidian for history is a really good way of tracking trade routes and movement of people. And so you can see, and it was interesting how they discovered it was like, okay, every mine has its own little unique what do you call it, like their composition, their chemical composition is slightly different. So obsidian found here has a different composition than obsidian found over here. And so they would find these big mines full of this certain kind of obsidian. Wow. And they'd find these artifacts throughout South America and Central America and even up into North America that they can trace. Oh, this culture started here, the trade went down this way, and then they could see where obsidian was traded for other things, because they could see where like fishing or something else was popular here, and there's a lot of evidence for that. And then they'd see the artifacts going up, like, so they'd see these, but specifically obsidian with the arrowheads and the blades and stuff was interesting to me, because they were able to tell exactly like where it came from, where it went, which areas had more of it in concentration. Wow. And like I just thought it was really cool.
That's amazing. Something you might appreciate here, and this is going to bore our viewers to death, but since it's the Richard and Laura show this week,
it's all about us, so buckle up.
The first time I ever came across obsidian blades was reading a Forgotten Realms novel.
No way.
Was it Douglas Niles? Was it who wrote Dark Walker on Moonshade? I can't remember the guy's name. that was kind of the first. Dark Walker and Moonshade was the first Forgotten Realms novel, I think, or one of the first. And it also wrote kind of a fantasy history set on the same planet, but a fantasy history, which was basically just a copy of the Mayans and the Europeans going across. and that was the first time I'd heard of a lot of that kind of culture stuff. That's what first got me interested into all the kind of South American things. It was just a fantasy novel.
That is awesome. That's so cool. I love when fantasy can like parallel reality so closely that it becomes relevant. Yeah. It's like on the Forgotten Realms subject, which has nothing to do with history, people, but you're gonna bear with us. I was talking to my best friend the other day about the R.A. Salvatore books and how he uses the Dark Elves and Dritz specifically to address race. And so he takes really relevant cultural problems and he writes it into his story, like racism and bigotry and stuff like that and genocide. And he discusses it using these fantasy plots, but it's really deep, relevant stuff.
Yeah. And that is a part of history. The fact that people have always used stories and songs and obviously this comes back to your kind of field of being an anthropologist, where people have used that stuff to communicate stories and real world problems and address stuff. Like in South Africa, there's a rich history of kind of using plays and music to kind of subvert the establishment.
Yeah. Well, think about epics. Like they used to be ways of communicating these big archetypal human experiences in story form using these like big heroes, but really what it's doing is communicating the different struggles and what it's like to be human,
Yeah,
I think that's interesting.
It is, and that's another side of historical study which is sometimes overlooked, the human aspect of it, and the human, that relaying into stories. And I think that's interesting in kind of my field, because obviously you get a lot of the stories in the Bibles, a lot of the books of the Bible, they're not historical books. They are the songs, or the what's the word I'm looking for? Like a simile for something else,
like fables or parable.
Yeah, parable. That's the word I'm looking for. Simile is the kind of Buddhist way of putting it. The parables and things, and there was a time when the Bible was considered a history book.
Yeah,
and it was read. All the stories were read in it as a history book. Yeah, and it's so interesting that I often say, especially to kind of atheists or people who are arguing against religious people, because they as prone to taking the Bible out of context as the religious people are.
Oh, absolutely.
And sometimes I just find myself getting so frustrated when someone's trying to say to a religious person, you're giving a bad argument. The Bible is this, and this, and I'm just thinking to myself, you've got that completely wrong. It is just a parable. It's not meant to be anything but a parable, and you're kind of reading so much into it.
That's kind of why I like people like Bart Ehrman, whether or not, like, because I know that people have their criticisms of him. I really respect him. I'm not one to even get involved in
him, and I have a criticism of him. So
I mean, me too. Like I'm one of those people that I can actually do that, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not even getting into the argument of the historicity of Jesus, but just the concept that like he takes the Bible and puts it in historical context rather than using it as historical context, and he's able to explain like what is that? He wrote one book. I think it was called like it was about how Jesus became God. I can't remember the name of it. But it's I'll have to look it up and put it in the show notes. But in the intro to his book, he writes this account of this person, right? It's a historical account that we have like written down historically, and it describes this person, and the whole time you think that they're talking about Jesus, and he's like, and this person's name was blah 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 from this other region, and they were contemporary with Jesus, and this was during a time when everybody was a Messiah, right? And we tend to forget, like, history gets rewritten every generation over and over again. And it has to either be rediscovered or argued or whatever. But we tend to forget, like, contemporarily what was going on during that time. There was a lot of messiahs. And not to criticize Christianity specifically, just to sort of praise Bart Ehrman in his way of taking these documents and putting them back into history, looking what else we have and looking at the other evidence around it and how it all fits together and how things intertwine and relate, who had exposure to what information and when, what trade routes were there, right? What was likely communicated between different civilizations. And you end up getting this completely different look at kind of like what I was talking about with the relief, right? Where it's like once you know the context, it's like, oh, we don't know anything else about it. You have a different perspective, right?
Yeah, one of the great things about Bart Ehrman is I saw him on, I don't want to get this wrong, I think it was the Myth Vision podcast.
Oh, I love
I saw an interview with him on that. And I believe it was a question from the chat which someone had asked him about slavery. And he kind of just gave them the kind of straight down the line historical answer. And I think that the kind of onus of the question was for him to say, well, yeah, slavery is this, that, and other in Bible, and kind of agree with the kind of attack against slavery in the Bible. And it was just so straight laced and like, well, we're not quite sure. You know, there were different forms. And it's so good at everything I've seen. Virtually every interview I've seen where things like that have come up, it's always been straight down the line and honest. And, you know, that's what's so good about it.
Well, yeah. I love that you said like the whole, and by the way, the book, I looked it up while you were talking, is How Jesus Became God. It's a super, super good book because historically, he started out as just Jesus and there was a lot of argument over whether or not. And so talking about history, it really does show how it's constantly evolving and how our opinions and views on it constantly change. But how what is seen as historical truth also constantly changes. So we have literally as a predominantly Christian society, we have a narrative that doesn't quite line up with the historical facts.
It's funny because on the subject of, and I don't want to, like I said, stay on the Jesus thing too long, but
I know we got to walk away from Bart Ehrman after this.
Subject of Jesus, well, it's not so much even Bart Ehrman, but the thing is, well, it is Bart Ehrman. He's like he's a teacher. He teaches in seminary school. He teaches a lot of Christian people, and he doesn't try and deconvert them. He just teaches them the facts. And I was reading, I think it was on Amazon, a review of one of his books once, and somebody was criticizing him because they were saying, well, he's not bringing anything new to the table with this book. Everybody knows what he's talking about. This is widespread knowledge. And I think that was kind of his point. Amongst scholars and things, this is widely known stuff. But to the general public, it isn't.
Well, and if it's widely known stuff, then what's one more voice in the matter, right?
Well, the thing, I've got two textbooks on the New Testament. I've got one by a Christian guy called John Drain, and these are academic textbooks. They're not kind of off the shelf like light reading like a lot of Bart Ehrman stuff is. And one of them is, the other one is by Bart Ehrman. Two completely different kind of approaches to the subject. And virtually carbon copies of each other as far as the historical information goes, which just shows that the kind of consensus of opinion. It doesn't matter whether you're a believer or not, the facts remain the same. And when you've got so many kind of, and I'm not saying like that this is cut, dried, solid, because there are like mysteries like the Q document, which informed Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Luke.
I don't know.
I'm going to embarrass myself.
Yeah, I'm not even gonna try and correct that one because I don't know. But like, there's the idea that there's a source document that they both drew from because they have these parallels, but they're different themselves. That they must have both drawn from the same source. That's the Q document. Yeah,
that's a Q, and that is it. And that was kind of that was one of these great things in history, in historical study, which you find in all fields of historical study, where when it was first put forward, it was put forward as kind of a placeholder, because it looked like that's what the document was at this point, but they never actually found this document.
And I don't even think that they need to. I think the whole idea is that there's some similarities and some differences, and that there's some discrepancies there, and that we don't know what the original document said or why these specific things were drawn from it, or if there even isn't a real, like, I've heard the argument that one of them is the source document, the other one is taken from it, and then I've heard arguments for why that's not the case, and I'm not even going to try and rehash those arguments now. But I think that what's most important is the fact that that we have to look at what we do know about any historical document, not just the Bible, but like any historical document. You take what we do have and you try to interpolate based on what stuff you have around it, right? So when you're talking about the Q document, what they're saying is we don't have this source document, therefore we have these two documents and we have to sort of interpolate based on these discrepancies. And so it shows, I mean, it doesn't just show that there's a problem with the Bible specifically. It shows that historical, like, pursuits of historical knowledge are freaking difficult.
Yeah. What about there seems to have been around 2,500, 2,600 years ago, kind of what would be called a Great Awakening. I don't want to sound good, all new agey.
You're talking sort of like an enlightenment, but before the Enlightenment, right? Like,
yeah, we're in ancient Greece and paralleled in India.
Oh yeah,
where all these things sprung up, and all of a sudden there were this kind of great push in thought, and these great minds that came along. And do you think? And I'm asking you specifically. Do you think that that has got something to do with, because I'm not entirely sure of the timeline on this, as when we stopped being kind of hunter-gatherers and started settling down, it gave us the opportunity
oh my gosh. And I'm glad that's where you were going with that, because I wasn't sure, but I was hoping. So there is a lot of
I'll let you continue then.
Yeah, because I know you're struggling.
You finish my thought.
Yeah, so there's a huge correlation, although, okay, so one thing I'll throw out there, whether you're looking at it from a historical or archaeological or anthropological perspective, is that when you talk about the past, it's really hard to determine cause and effect, right? It's more about correlations and links and stuff like that. So there's a link between, and I'd say it's a direct cause and effect, but that's just my own personal arrogance saying that. Between when we stopped being hunter-gatherers and first became more agricultural and pastoral, and then when we started these big civilizations like larger cities, people were able to specialize. So whereas before it was like you're going to go out and spend so much of your day finding food, and so much of your day making clothes, and so much of your day caring for your children, and it's all partitioned and you're always busy. There just isn't downtime. Hunter-gatherer is when you also start seeing like really rudimentary things like jewelry and stuff, which wasn't beforehand. But that's because once you hunt and gather your food and you're able to keep it in one spot, you're able to sit there for longer periods, and you can do things like innovate jewelry, right?
Yeah.
Make more advanced weapons and things like that. But yes, then we start having like specialized trades, right? And that's where you start getting.
Can I just intrude? This is just a question. Again, I don't know. Wasn't it? There was certainly artwork going off while people were kind of wandering nomads, weren't they? Because they found antlers carved and things from like 50,000 years ago.
Oh yeah, and like carved stones and all kinds of stuff like that, like rudimentary beads. I mean, obviously, we always talk about like when you talk about prehistoric history, you always talk about like cave art and stuff like that. So yeah, I think art has been like I think if anyone wanted to link art specifically to civilization, as in like cities and more complex social structures, I would say that's bullshit. Like art's been around for a lot longer than that. If that's your question. But yeah, to get on with my incredibly long-winded answer, it does start eventually developing to where there are people who are able to support themselves monetarily or get supported monetarily while doing absolutely nothing but thinking, right? So people like Aristotle, Plato, like historians and scholars and stuff like that. When you free up an individual to not have to seek out a food source, they're going to go do something else, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. But that's something that we discussed a lot when we were doing the evolution of complexity of human social structures. That was discussed a lot.
Yeah. I found that's one area, like when we were talking about prehistory and the dinosaurs and things earlier, that's one area that's it doesn't seem to be talked about a great deal outside kind of academic circles. The kind of the just coming into civilization, the settling down, kind of the Neolithic period where where religion proper and warfare and all that. When people started gathering in cities, and then they obviously had resources to protect and things, and they started killing each other for resource rather than just for fun or sacrifice.
Well, I would say first, wouldn't it be like people kill each other? I don't know what the order is, but I'm going to make it up, right? Like what I would think. First, they kill each other out of need for like resources, but like territory protection, right? And then it becomes kill each other for actual like, no, I want to build a civilization here and I want to own this land. Not so territory protection, like, hey, we're moving through this area and now we see a threat, we're going to limit the threat, but we're going to be nomadic. And then warfare. But then I think sacrifice, I think that, God, I don't want to be wrong here, but I think that came after all of that, because you don't start, having those complex religious ideas until later. But I don't know. There could have been like hunter gatherers.
That's interesting, because I've never ever even thought about that.
Yeah, I don't know. So that was just my guess off my head. I'd have to research it.
I think this is a really interesting kind of route to look at, because thinking about it, it makes, and this is just me in my own head now with no kind of professional thing going off at all.
Kind of like what I just did. Yeah.
About it, it makes kind of not really much sense if you're hunter gathering about and wandering about to kind of kill each other off, because it's such a hard existence anyway.
Yeah. There's a lot of evidence that there was very little warfare when the bands were smaller. And the evidence would be so what they would consider evidence for warfare. I'm sorry, I have to itch my eye because it's smoky here and there's ashes everywhere. What they would consider evidence for warfare is when they can find bones that have been killed, like a person who's been killed, but they could see wounds inflicted that were from a weapon instead of from an animal.
Yeah.
So yes, there's a very good chance that there's a lot we don't know, but from what we can see, what we can gather, there's a lot less warfare or signs of warfare when the groups were smaller. And they kind of see it in indigenous tribes today. When you have tribes that are very, very separated and very small and very, very insular, there's less problems. But then you start having closer together tribes and they're competing or whatever, and you get more bickering. But that you brought something up that I have to touch on when you said something about religion and ancient history and stuff. Like we were talking about the evolution of trades, right? And people specializing in stuff. What's really interesting to me is when you track back in time, like through ancient history, the development of religions, from what we do know, you don't get like ruling gods until you get ruling people, right? So whereas before it was like spirits of the world, and there may have even been creation stories, but a lot of it has to do with like ancestor worship and spirits and like the god of thunder and stuff like that. It's all very fractured and disorganized, and there's no one, like there's no structure to it. It's just a way of describing reality. Like you almost can't even call it a religion, except that there's explanations for things, right?
Yeah.
And then you start getting more complex civilizations, and you start getting more complex religions, and then you get these like ruling classes, and then you get these ruling gods. And so I thought that was really, really interesting, the correlation there. Like you don't get the one true God that created everything and the rules over all of us until you have like the one true king that's in charge of the whole town, right? So it's really interesting.
Yeah, certainly in early kind of the early days of the Bible, shall we say, for want of a better phrase, it's well known amongst kind of academics that there was many gods.
Mm-hmm.
God wasn't saying, you shall have no other gods before me, because he was saying he was the only God. He was saying you shall have no other gods before me, because he was saying I am the best God.
Yep, I'm the big bad guy on the block. Yeah. Yeah. And he was adapted from multiple different gods. And they can kind of show that historically. So what's interesting to me about different types of history is how they will accept or reject certain things. So there's two things that you make me think of off the top of my head, completely because of my worldview and my exposure. But I'm sure there's other examples. One is biblical history and how it only takes into account the whole Old Testament thing, but it doesn't take into account Jewish history. And so a lot of Jewish people don't even like Jewish history shows that they were polytheistic. And now, yes, even common modern day Jews, I think, are now monotheistic. I think that they also deny that there's other gods, if I remember right. I don't want to speak for the Jewish religion because I don't know enough about it, but I think it's predominantly monotheistic. But historically, they can show where it was polytheistic, and that each ruling tribe had their Each tribe had their ruling god or patron god or whatever. And the other thing is like sort of like and this will be interesting for us to talk about with you being on the other side of the pond, American history and how it's written, where it's not necessarily a lie, but it's not necessarily the truth. It's like spun in a certain way to really nationalize this narrative of here's our history. Let's be so proud of it. Oh, the revolution and how great everything was. And all these American heroes who founded our nation, and like, never mind that they raped people and killed Native Americans and stole land and kept slaves. But there's like this narrative of this is what our history is.
On that point, I don't want to interrupt you mid-flow,
no,
but
go
on
for
that
it.
on that point of, are you taught in kind of schools about the fact that you went along and kind of, I say you, it was
I did personally. I was there.
Are you taught that
we can't be friends, by the
way? The early settlers, so they came from over here. So, are you taught that the early settlers kind of went in and did these horrific things to the indigenous peoples? You're not, because this. Like, oh my God, I'm going to come on to a really interesting point. I'm going to let you finish, but I'm going to follow up with an interesting point.
Okay.
Go on. So,
I thought you were gonna give the interesting point first.
No, I'm going to wait.
Yeah, so it really depends on the teacher and the class specifically. Obviously, in college, you're going to get a little bit more of a picture, and if you have a really good teacher, you're going to get a really critical picture. I took a anthropology of Native Americans class, and it was literally history from a Native American perspective, and I learned a ton in that class. That just not even just historically, but like within the last present day. Last few decades, and then also going back to I just learned so much from that perspective that I didn't even know was true. But no, the typical, let's say, elementary school child, where you get like the foundation of your historical knowledge. You learn all about the Pilgrims and how wonderful they were, and they were escaping religious persecution and all this other stuff, and they wanted freedom for people. And you're taught about like Thanksgiving as being this coming together of Native Americans, and I mean there is like tidbits of truth to the Thanksgiving story that we're taught, but it's really not that close to historical records. So I mean, it really puts a very positive spin. Like, we were all buddy with Native Americans, and we traded with them, and they helped us, and we helped them. And I mean, so by the time you get to middle school and high school, you move on to more things like world history and sociology and economics and government and stuff, and you stop learning about that kind of stuff. So it kind of gets pushed under the rug. Right. A lot of stuff I didn't learn until like the last decade.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, that's very interesting to me, because if you go back to when I was kind of first learned about Native Americans school, I was quite young, like maybe 5 or 6, talking about the very early 80s. Mm-hmm. And at that time, we were still regularly like on a weekly basis, I had reruns of the old black and white cowboy movies where the Indians were the bad guys and the cowboys were the good guys and stuff. But even then, when we were at school, even in the early 80s, we were taught that, that was a skewed picture of history. And the Native Americans, had been kind of had their land plundered and stuff like that. We were taught kind of from what I'm hearing from you, we were taught a more correct version of American history.
Yeah, definitely more critical, more
critical. But the interesting point I wanted to bring up is that we were taught fuck all about how England had gone and raided Ireland and Scotland.
Oh yeah. Oh,
we were
so you bring a
nothing
good point
about that whatsoever. Yeah. Nothing. I learned nothing about Irish history until middle of secondary school.
See, and in world history, we would have been taught those kinds of things. And each section of the world would have been like its own little blurb, and it wasn't necessarily focused on. So it's not so much that we focused on English and Irish relations and that whole history, but we were certainly taught the overall points of it. But what were you guys taught on like colonialism and stuff, and like specifically British colonialism? Taboo question.
No, it's not a taboo question. I'm just can't breathe and laugh at the same time due to this coronavirus after effects I've got going off. But not much. We were still talking about the British Empire. We were told, from what I can remember, there was kind of hints that it was a bit of an invasion. But not much. Yeah, but that's it. That's it was literally. We were still in the kind of phase then. And bear in mind, this was you've got to, and this is not an excuse for it because it's disgusting, but you've got to bear in mind this was like 5 or 6, 7 maybe years after the Sex Pistols that had come out, and before then there was really no kind of mainstream kind of voices against the monarchy. Or anything like that. They were if you spoke out against the monarchy, you were like a subvert, really bad. And then until punk came along and kind of
cracked that egg open
for kind of younger people who went out and rebelled against the older generation and stuff. That just wasn't a done thing. So this was very, very close to that when I was in school, like in junior school. So the British Empire was still a good thing. We'd gone and conquered the world, but it was for the benefit of the world.
And I have heard, gosh, I'm going to go off on a tangent there where I didn't want to go, but if you're talking about progress as being a positive, all these things that we have done as humans historically have resulted in progress. So I don't know if it's a net good or net bad or what, but I can see where anything can kind of be spun into, but look where we turned out. We have like TVs and like canned drinks that I don't have to worry about where I'm going to get my clean water, so
on the back of thousands of dead people.
I know, isn't that crazy? And so
progress.
I know. So sure, we can spin anything in terms of like what was the positive outcome from it, even slavery and like the cotton trade and stuff. Like as atrocious as it was, you can have economists or historians or sociologists talk about like, yes, but here's where it set up our cultures to be where they are today. But like going back to the colonialism thing, it was very similar the way that we were taught it. Like it was kind of a good thing, but it was more like, because I don't think it was taught in terms of like Britain is bad. We were more taught in terms of like like the expansion of the Western world and the educated world. We weren't even necessarily taught how educated the Eastern world was. Not that we were like purposely lied to about it, but we were always, it was a good thing that colonialism happened, right? And like the falls of all those nations, it was almost presented, if I remember it right as a kid, my impression was always that it was their fault, not, like, oh, Africa the way it is now, that's Africans' fault, right? India the way it is now, like any sort of like economic crisis or whatever, like that's because of them, right? And not even taking into account that when colonialism failed and people withdrew, they withdrew all the support and all the, they kind of left things to like let the chips fall where they may. You know what I'm saying? We weren't taught any critical aspects of it.
It's a great conversation to have, and it's especially the slavery one, because there's no denying that it brought prosperity to the Western world.
Right.
What needs to happen now, and I'm going to go out on a limb and put myself there in now, is that those people who suffered most from that needs to be repaid for that now. And the governments who were involved in that, all of the governments, because there's a lot of talk about like America kind of repaying African Americans for the shit they went through. But I think all governments who were involved in it needs to get together and really fucking give these people something back. Give them the opportunities, give them money, it's never going to excuse it.
No.
But at least fucking acknowledge what they did for America.
And try to make
Britain
But here's where I have to play the devil's advocate, or where I get a little skeptical, is like, that sounds fucking fantastic. And that would be so good to get the playing field evened out a little bit. But how do you do that? Right. So going back to my Native American class, right, and studying the Paiutes and stuff like that, one thing that I learned in studying that tribe is that America is shitty with reparations. And despite whatever the best intentions were, it has been fucked up time after time after time. And I don't think including more governments will necessarily make that better, because now you have more voices and bureaucracy and arguments and disagreements and vying for, I want this and I want that. Right. And so my big question is, like, as human beings and as governments, it's great to want to say, like, hey, this was screwed up in the past and we need to make amends. And I agree with you there. How do we actually do it where it actually benefits the people that actually need it? Right.
I think that question, and I'm not trying to sidestep it, although I am sidestepping it, but I think that question has to be down to the people in that community. I've got no right to speak for those people on how we do it. Those people whose ancestors were affected by that and who are now continually affected by that, by being underrepresented and one of the largest groups in poverty, they're the people who need to make that decision. They're the people who need to turn around to the government and say, right, this is what we think.
So, when you talked about like the elusive, there's two problems with that. One is like the elusive they, who is they? So you say those people who.
Yeah, I don't mean it like a Von Daniken kind of way.
Well, I mean, like, is it like an elected representative from multiple Black communities or multiple Native American communities? Is it chiefs? Is it like who qualifies? If you're a Black person in America, but you actually migrated from like Sweden like 10 years ago, right? Do you get reparations for slavery? Right? Like, how do you qualify people? I think who the they is complicated. But the other issue,
I've heard conversations on this, but I don't know enough to speak pretty much on it. I know I've heard Cynthia McDonald speak on this before, and I don't remember
this
exactly
specific
what
topic.
She said,
it would be so great to have her on a podcast later and go back to this topic. Like, we should, in fact, we're gonna write it down on our thing, like reparations, because I not only think that it's necessary to admit our past and to make up for our past and to even the playing field and give everyone opportunities, I also recognize that as humans and as large civilizations, we're pretty fucked up. And to get that stuff to actually happen is difficult. Which brings me to my second point, which is like, where and how. Like, governments are broke. Like, I don't know if you know about America, but we're like not rich. we're in so many trillions of debt, and since COVID and just handing people paychecks out of freaking nowhere, we're even more in debt. So well, okay, that brings up a counterpoint, right? If they can give all of America this much money, how come you can't give a small percentage of the population more than that, but like, like a little bit more focused?
Yeah, they can,
so there's
they can
so
manage
much
to manage to pay out when it suits them to pay out, but they can't manage to pay out information for somebody who who's really deserving of it.
When the stock market requires it, then let's go ahead and do it. But oh gosh.
I think to kind of draw a line, because we don't represent that community or any of those communities. And I think to draw a line on it and move on, I think.
And we can talk about doing a show down the road. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we can safely say that they need that fucking thing to happen.
And so much more than that. I mean, I really do
my opinion on it,
because there's more than just that. There's like the housing, right?
Yeah.
Back during segregation and stuff.
And that's part of the larger. That's part of that larger question, and that's why we need somebody on to talk about it who is informed and who
does that sort of activism and is informed and knowledgeable and can speak on it. I like your idea of Cynthia. We should talk to her. But anyway, so moving on. So to bring the audience back around and bring ourselves back around, the reason why we started talking about slavery is we were talking about sort of like the changing of history. I'd call that specific one more like whitewashing of history, but I would preface that only with it happens through all kinds of different cultures, regardless of race or color or ethnicity. Like you go to a specific culture and you're gonna get their specific history, right? And or their specific take on it. And you go to a specific religion and you're gonna get their specific interpretation of their history or their past based on their own religion. So, but what America does in terms of educating children on American history it's nothing new and it's nothing specifically American. That is one thing that I think is really important to articulate. And that's interesting. Like that brings me to my next potential subject, which is whose view of history. Like when we say history, whose history? Like how do we determine which history is the history? And do we stick with the ones that our culture says here's your history, or do we look at all of them or none of them, or like what would you consider history versus cultural narrative?
That's a very good question, because I was actually just going to make that distinction myself. That I think there is a distinction between academic history and cultural history. What's kind of popular in the culture things, and they don't always match up. Go
ahead.
That is a really interesting question. How do we assess what is real history from an academic point of view? Relies, I think, on weighing the evidence and looking at all the different types of evidence and seeing what is most probably the case.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to clarify, what is most probably the case based on multiple sources, not just based on one.
Yeah.
Whereas kind of cultural history is a whole different ball game altogether, and we've kind of just been talking about this. But we can, I think, bringing it forward to a more like recent kind of thing, because I wanted to bring it forward to kind of the 20th and 21st century anyway, and this seems to be a good opportunity to do it. That if you have a look at kind of newspaper headlines and things, if you're assessing history via looking at newspaper headlines, and I'm kind of drawn to the Brexit thing.
Oh, good.
We've just gone through.
Good example. Yeah.
Is that, you know, depending on which side of the argument you were on, it's either the greatest thing since sliced bread, or it's like the end of the world.
Oh, right. And there's no middle ground.
There's no, I mean, I consider myself kind of level-headed and impartial on most things. I took a side on that, and I don't know anybody who didn't.
So then at that point, wouldn't it be, and this pertains to history too, wouldn't it be what you're considering facts and what you're considering important and what you're considering a pro and a con, right?
Yeah, I think.
Like, to give you an example.
So biased.
Go ahead.
I think the majority of people who are on the, I'm not going to say which side of the argument.
On the opposite side of yours.
But I think the people who are on the other side of the argument
exclusively, and this is going to sound biased, but this is my genuine opinion on the matter.
Mm-hmm.
I've not heard a good argument.
Yeah.
I literally did not hear a good argument, a convincing argument. To me, it was kind of, when we in our community talk quite a lot about religious people and how that, we're not religious because we've not heard convincing arguments. It is literally on the same level as that. Every argument I heard for the other from the other team, was, and that was literally how it was seen in Britain, and it's kind of been took over by coronavirus, but that was how it was seen in Britain. It was literally that dividing. That it was like two teams going against each other. It literally split families apart.
Yeah, that's kind of how it seems when we read the news. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. And I think I didn't hear a convincing argument. Nothing that convinced me at all. Even people who were divided in the same kind of fields, like farming. There were people who in that community were on different sides of the fence. When I'm trying not to give my position away here because I don't want to politicize it as much as possible, but those who were on the opposite side of the fence to me in farming just seemed to be doing it from very selfish motivations, which benefited them and no one else.
And that happens a lot. And in some ways, that's not bad. It's not bad to represent your wants or your needs or what will benefit you. It becomes bad when you're talking about it harming other people, which, depending on the arguments, that's often the case. Like you think about slavery. I mean, slavery, right? Yeah. Colonialism, right? Sure, there was benefit, but at whose account, right? Yeah. So that makes decisions to me a little bit more cut and dry. But I think you bring up a good point when you're talking about getting history from the news. Is we almost do the same thing with history, but the opposite, where it's like we read history like it is news, right? So first you have like news itself, you don't always know exactly how accurate it is, but when you read it in a newspaper, it suddenly has more veracity. And I think that's the same way we approach history books, is because it's in a book, it has more veracity. But the other thing that you made me think of is, I think it just popped into my head while you were talking, like, I wonder how they'll view Brexit like 100 years in the future. Will it even be something worth mentioning in contrast to all the big scope of big history? Like, it might seem like a big deal to us now, but from a historical perspective, is that something that historians are going to key in on? Or is it going to be like, yeah, they had this thing at this time and whatever,
It's funny actually, because it's even now there's still ongoing arguments about it because of the whole pandemic thing.
Yeah.
A lot of the negative effects that were possibly forecast from Brexit, which are now with us, are being blamed on coronavirus. So is it coronavirus that did it? This is the argument. Is it coronavirus that did it? Or is it Brexit that did it and coronavirus is a convenient excuse to kind of...
Why is it that people always look for an exact scapegoat? Like, why can't it be both? Or why can't it be more complex than that? Like, it's so ridiculous to me that people can't see complex systems for what they are. Like if you think of, I don't know, a culture or society as like a car, there's a lot of moving parts, and it's like you have something that happens to your car. Well, sometimes you can say, oh, this is a result of that, and sometimes you have like 2 or 3 different things that go wrong, and you're like, well, which one caused what, and which one happened first, and are they independent, like mechanical problems, or if I had fixed this other one sooner, would it have prevented this other one? And someone who's a really, really, really good mechanic can see how everything connects, everything works, and this caused that, and that break, and that could not possibly have affected this in any way or whatever. They know the complexities. So you talk about, like, I don't know, economists or political scientists and stuff, and maybe they can start getting a general idea, because of how complicated it is, of how multiple things affect things. The average person, it's like, oh, blame Corona, right? And Corona probably had a huge bit to do with it. But what about this other thing over here, and this other thing over here, and this and that, right? And so yeah, it's really weird to me when people say, like, was it Brexit or was it Corona? Like, I mean, it was probably both, right?
It's interesting how you mention how will it be viewed in kind of 100 years time, because if you think about it, there seems to be a kind of, and I don't know if it's a living memory thing that we know people who were kind of around. I certainly have a friend who's 93-year-old who, although it was kind of maybe 11 or 12 during the Second World War, was around when the Second World War was going on. And we kind of, when you think back to the Second World War, it seems like kind of very vivid recent history, or even the First World War.
It's not that far off.
It seems to be recent history. But if you go just a little bit before that, not too much before that, to kind of the Boer War, then you start thinking, oh, that was ancient. No one remembers the kind of Boer War. And I wonder if it's, and this is an open question, I don't know the answer. I don't know if you know the answer. I wonder if it's a thing that certainly I have known people who were alive in my lifetime. I've known people who were alive in the First World War.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why it's so vivid. What do you think on that?
My short answer is I don't know. But my longer answer is I agree with you. I think that there's part of it has to do with the fact that people, and this is my guess, right? Like, honestly, I really don't know. But I would think that not just because people are still alive, but because the cultural narrative is still alive. So you start talking about World War I, that narrative is still alive.
Yeah.
So you think about like, I don't know anybody who was alive during the Revolutionary War, but here in America, that narrative is still very much alive. We have 4th of July, and we have how we're taught about it in schools. And we're not just taught about it in schools, we are taught about it in schools, right? Like, it's a big freaking deal to know about that kind of stuff. So the more and more we keep that narrative going, but there was like just on nonprofits the other day when I was on it, we were talking about the fall of Black Wall Street, right? I didn't even know about that until I was researching it for the nonprofits show. And that was more recent history, like within my parents' lifetime. And just like a decade or so before I was born. And I didn't even know about it because it's not a part of our cultural narrative and it's not a part of the conversation. So I think that's what keeps certain events like just going.
It's funny you should say that, because I've learned so much about American history from watching the nonprofits, and I don't know how much I'm allowed to talk about this. I was contacted by because I'm going to be on the nonprofits on the, when is it, 8th of August.
Awesome. So that's when you're recording it, right?
No, that we're recording on the 5th.
Okay. So 8th is when it's going to air.
8th is the Sunday it actually airs, yeah. And I don't want to give away who's going to be on it because I don't know how public knowledge this is, but
and it changes as people.
Yeah, the anchor sent me a kind of list of topics that they were going to put forward and talk about, and asked me what I thought about them. And one of them that came up was, I don't remember exactly what it was. It's something to do with right-wing politics in America. And I just said to them, I have no clue on that subject. I mean, I'm happy to talk about it if that's what you want to talk about, but I have no clue.
Then that would actually make you a very valuable. See, this is like blending history with politics, because now you're bringing up a good point. It is good to have that voice of curiosity, that voice of like, I don't know, right? So you get on to nonprofits, and like, let's say we have a whole bunch of us on there, like a whole panel of people who think that they know what right-wing politics is in America. And we all have our opinions on it. And some might be a little bit more extreme than others, either pro or against, right? And some might be more middle of the road and, hey, here's why, right? But now you have someone coming from the outside, you're going to offer a fresh perspective. And why that's good is you not knowing means that you can analyze what's being said from a neutral perspective and be like, especially because on average, a lot of like, oh God, I almost don't want to, I don't really want to out like, oh, the majority of people on our shows are this or that, politically, because that's not my place to say. But we do tend to fall on a certain end of the political spectrum. So we will tend to, on average, bring a specific point of view to that conversation, period. right?
Yeah.
So I think having you on there would offer like a fresh point of view and maybe get people thinking in a way that they hadn't thought, or that you wouldn't give them that opportunity if you weren't there representing that unique view.
I just realized that the recording of that show I'm on actually takes place the same day this show is airing.
Yes.
It's so confusing recording in advance.
Okay, so let's throw in like a nice little commercial here. This Sunday, catch Richard Gilliver on The Nonprofits.
Yeah, and while we're at it, the following Tuesday, I'm on The Perspective. I might as well get that in as well. while we're here doing the commercial stuff.
Like, I think honestly
we've got some kind of discussion group that goes off as well.
Oh, what is it on Facebook? Look us up on Linktree. Yeah, no,
we're doing such a good job without you, Gil.
Yes. Now your question should be, is Laura going to edit in an actual commercial little break thingy, or is she going to just let this run straight through without the music? Depends on how I feel that day. But no, talking about what we were saying with you being on the nonprofits and not knowing and bringing that fresh perspective. I like that, not just in terms of talking about politics, but in terms of talking about history. Like having one thing that I love having kids and homeschooling them is the questions and the criticisms and critiques and critical thinking that goes into, well, why did they do this? And why was it that way? And why do we need to learn this stuff? Right? Which sounds like a frustrating question, but it's pretty dang valid. Why is it important to learn about the Revolutionary War? Right.
Yeah, kids are amazing. My I don't know if it was my son or my daughter the other day asked me a question. And I said, let's have a think about it. And they went, can't we just ask Google? And I'm like, no, because, just asking, just finding the answer isn't always the important thing. Sometimes we need to think about it and go into it and ask ourselves why the answer is the way the answer is.
Ooh, yeah.
And my kids are young, so it's not tremendously concerning, but I love kind of getting them to think like that, to go deeper instead of just like, let's just ask for the answer. No, let's ask the question.
So I'm very
find the answer.
Yeah, I get very sciencey in my approach with almost everything with the kids, even including language. But like the other day, so by the other day, like maybe a year or so ago, I picked up pine cone and a sepal, like a piece of the pine tree that's like the little thing that has the little things that fall off of it. And I was like, hey, what do you guys think that these things are? Right? Like, what is this? And they were all across the board. They're like, a baby pine cone, right? And I was like, no, like you can look up in the tree and see what a baby pine cone looks like. It's just like a pine cone, but it's harder and smaller and it's like really tough and hard. And then it grows bigger and bigger. And then eventually it opens up, right? No, this thing's different. It behaves differently. What is it? And so they got to learn. And before I gave them any answers or any clues, I made them each guess what they thought it was. And of the 3 kids, not a single one, even the teenager, got it right. And then I discussed the gender of plants, right? Like trees and flowers and stuff, they have the female part and the male part, right?
Yeah.
The pine cone has the pine nut, which is the seed. And the sepal is like the little things that crush off of it. That's the male part. Like that's basically the sperm of the tree. And then they were like, ew, gross. So when all that yellow stuff is all over our house and our car and stuff, like that's like it's basically tree sperm, right? But it was cool because like the whole point of that story.
Get educated. Listen to the Richard on the show.
I don't know why that's the example that popped into my head. But that says a lot about me, doesn't it? No, but the point of that was that getting them to think about it first and make their own guesses and their own hypotheses. And then afterwards we could research it more so they knew, like, is mom telling the truth? Is she right? Is she wrong? Right. But it was funny. It was like, before just giving them an answer, like ask them what they think the answer is and get them acknowledging that their guesses could be wrong if nothing else,
Yeah. Definitely right. I'm going to cut it because
yes, I was waiting for the 45-minute mark. It hasn't popped
I don't
up.
think we've got one. No, I think it must operate differently with 2 people.
I guess so, because I'm like, dude, it's 3:30 and I thought I would be done by 3. So yeah.
The thing is, if let's face it, if I don't stop it,
I won't stop
you're not going to stop it. And
No.
the way we interact, we could have a 5-hour show each.
Let's not do that. Let's not. We want to get more subscribers, not start losing subscribers. So
thank you to our audience for putting up with me and Laura just rambling.
I'm
just catching up. Basically, we've just been catching up.
If you got some good knitting done or cross stitch while we were, you're so welcome, by the way.
So last thoughts on history. Come on, before we cut it.
History is dynamic. It's complicated. So take everything with a grain of salt. Take everything with curiosity, and not to say that something is not true, not to say that something is true, but don't be afraid to ask questions and look more into it and be curious about it.
And don't let your prejudice interfere. Yeah. Don't, if you know, we've talked about Bart Ehrman on this episode. We've talked about him before. We've, the New Testament scholarship is something I'm getting really into. And you don't just go to the sources that you think will agree with you. Go out and read your Christian scholars. Most of my books on the New Testament or on Christianity are from Christians. They really, really are. Go and look at the alternative viewpoint, because if they're doing the job properly, it won't make one bit of difference as to what the conclusion is.
But the information in there might be good.
Yeah, don't be put off because they're Christian or they haven't got the same view. And that's not just a Christian thing. It's not just a religion thing. All areas of history, no matter what your area of study is in history, don't only look at the sources which you think might favor your opinion. Go and look at those alternative sources. You might have your mind changed for the better by doing that.
Even if you don't have an opinion, if you're going to take, like, let's say you're studying like Haitian history, right? And you have no specific opinions or thoughts or beliefs about Haiti, right? Yeah, look at all the different types of histories out there and the different perspectives and cultural narratives, because somewhere in the middle is closer to the truth than just one of them. But you'll also learn a lot more. Yeah. So yeah, thank you guys all for joining us. I know that Richard already thanked you, but thank you from me as well. And I hope to hear you guys on Facebook, get to have some conversations. And not that you need the reminder, but I am Laura.
I'm Richard, and this has been Skeptic Hangout. And until next time,
stay skeptical.
I don't know what Richard's
no, I'm sorry. I'm supposed to say stay curious. Let's do that again. So I say stay curious. You say,
I don't know what it is.
Oh my God. Just say,
let's just bye.
You know what? I'm not even going to cut this, because this is what happens when Gil's not here. We fall apart. So see you all later.
Love you. Thank you for watching. Bye.
Bye.